Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talks at Google. My name is Jana Suarez, and I'm a Global Marketing Manager. I'm excited to have with us Jeremy Utley and Perry Klebahn joining us today. Jeremy Utley is the Director of Executive Education at Stanford's d.school and an adjunct professor at Stanford School of Engineering. He is the co-host of the d.school's widely popular program, Stanford's Masters of Creativity. Perry Klebahn is a co-founding member of Stanford's d.school faculty. He is an adjunct professor and director of executive education at Stanford d.school. He has served as COO for Patagonia and as CEO of Timbuktu. Jeremy and Perry are the co-authors of a new book, Ideaflow, the only business metric that matters. Innovation is not an event, a workshop, or a sprint, or a hackathon. It's a result of mastering Ideaflow, a practice that elevates everything else you do. In their book, they offer a proven strategy for routinely generating and commercializing breakthrough ideas and set the record straight on some foundational mindsets and practices that fuel not just repeatable innovation, but satisfaction and engagement at work and in life. Jeremy and Perry, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Jana.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. So being the fantastic professors that you both are, I know that you've prepared a wonderful lecture today. So for those of you watching live, we're going to start with a presentation for about 30 minutes and then switch over to moderated Q&A. So please add your questions or comments for Perry and Jeremy to the YouTube chat at any point during the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Perry and Jeremy.
Thank you so much. We're delighted to be here and to get to share some of our obsession for the last 12 years. This question of how do breakthroughs happen has been something that's really fueled a lot of our thinking and teaching for the last dozen years as we've led not only entrepreneurs and leaders in our graduate programs, but also executives in the professional development program that we run at the d.school. And as we have done that, we've become aware of the mythology that surrounds creativity and innovation. And it's encapsulated in a phrase that maybe some folks have heard, this 0 to 1 mentality. It's, in a way, it's the opposite of what we believe. Not that we don't love the book 0 to 1. It's actually a spectacular guidebook for founders, but 0 to 1 as an expression of people who start with nothing and then create something is kind of at its core part of the problem with the thinking around innovation and entrepreneurship. And if you're not careful, these myths can kind of make you believe that there's a class of people who are unlike you who can do something that you can't do. You know, we heard a CEO of one of the largest organizations in Silicon Valley say recently, you know, the founder of our company was a 0 to 1 guy, but when he brought me in, I'm a 1 to infinity guy. And everybody in the audience loved that line. We took issue with it because we don't believe in 0 to 1 people necessarily. We believe that innovation is a craft, is an ability that you can hone with practice, and yet it remains shrouded in mystery. So we want to talk about a couple of the myths that are embedded in this phraseology. Again, not to take down that book at all, but rather to establish what the truth is about creativity and innovation, because it's very different. This is Jerry Yulsman. He's a photography professor at the University of Florida, and he was one of the great Ansel Adams's photography assistants. Yulsman ran a fascinating study in his class at Florida recently, which illustrates some of the pitfalls and some of the misconceptions about breakthrough work that we've identified. He basically divided his class in two, and he said to half the class, okay, we're going to have a bunch of distinguished photographers come in at the end of the semester, and they're going to evaluate your work. The half of the class over here, your work is going to be evaluated on its quality. Okay. You have to deliver a truly spectacular photo to get an A. Now, you only have to do one, but it's got to be spectacular. If it's anything less than spectacular, it's going to be a B or below, right? And everybody wants to do A quality work. And by the way, you can picture the photo as a metaphor for any time you want to get to really breakthrough output. This experiment has bearing. The second half of the class, what he said was, you're not going to be measured on the quality of your work at all. The jury, in fact, isn't even really going to look at your photos. What they're going to do is they're going to count the number of photos you made over the course of the semester. And if you make over 100 photos and turn them in, doesn't matter how bad they are, you're going to get an A. If you make over 90, again, doesn't matter how bad they are, you're going to get a B. At the end of the semester, Yulsman and his jurors were really surprised to discover two things. The first thing, and you might be expecting this, was nobody in this half of the class made a single A caliber photo. Nobody. Despite the fact that their assignment was just turn in at least one exceptional photo. They couldn't do it. But the second surprise, which perhaps is even more surprising, is lots of students in this half of the class got A's per their criteria of quantity, but they also got A's per the criteria of quality. And what Yulsman discovered through that experiment is something that's been proven across fields, which is if you want truly breakthrough outcomes, quantity is what drives quality. And it's very unexpected. And it gets at the heart of this myth, right? When we think about 0 to 1, all of us necessarily think of 0 to the one right thing, as if we have nothing and we do a little bit of work, we get a little bit of something, we do a little bit more work, get a little bit more, and then there's this ta-da moment. And the truth is that's nothing could be farther from the truth. One of the smartest living professors, Dr. Dean Keith Simonton, he recently won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the organization that awards IQ points. So clearly an intelligent individual. He studied breakthrough thinking across domains and across disciplines, wrote a wonderful book we'd recommend called The Origins of Genius. But if you don't have time to read, a 500-page academic book, which our book is not, by the way, but if you don't have time to read it, here's the basic point that he makes. The most important variable that affects the quality of your work or your ideas is actually the quantity of your work and your ideas. And he studied not only the arts and painting and literature and things like that, but also hard sciences and engineering and physics. And he found that this is a pattern that recurs across disciplines. And yet it's strikingly difficult for people to appreciate this. I mean, Perry and I had the chance to go all over the world teaching the tools that have been pioneered at the D.school, right? We'll go to Tokyo or Tel Aviv or Topeka, Kansas. And when we tell people we're going to help them come up with ideas, we get the same universal response despite the radical cultural differences of those three places. Whether you're in Japan or Israel or Kansas, people say, how do you come up with good ideas? And we say, who said anything about good? We said we help you come up with ideas. But this notion of quality is almost indistinguishable from the very essence of an idea. And that's actually part of the mythology that holds us back, because for most of us, we should stop thinking of good ideas and we should start trying to come up with lots of ideas, focusing more on quantity and orienting more towards quantity than quality. Lots of quality follows when we make that shift.
And then the other myth we want to talk about is getting at this idea of the quantity Jeremy talks about. It sets up a lot of sort of what we researched and looked into or leveraged other people's research really to write the book, is around what is the quantity. So there's a benefit to working at Stanford, and we're around all kinds of smart researchers. And one of the folks we collaborate a lot with is Bob Sutton, who's written a lot of great books around leadership and leadership behaviors. And early on, this is I think it's 20 years old when he initially did some of the original data collection. But he collected data inside of organizations. IDEO helped him, and then he went out and got a PhD student, Andy Hargadon, to help him. And they collected data around how many ideas does it take to get something into the market, if you just thinking commercially, or actually having something out there that's an idea that you turned into something that's a product or service that's living on and doing something in the world. If you go backwards through this set of numbers here, 1 is the number of things that get out to the market. 5 is the number of things that need to get incubated or sustained as an offer. 100 is the number of things that got prototyped or quickly flushed out in some way. And 2,000 is the number of ideas. And they backed up through this whole funnel. It's sort of an extraordinary aha moment, at least for me looking at it, was, wow, that's a level of magnitude larger than I actually teach, in terms of the techniques. And sort of extraordinary to think about generating material being such a core part of a creative function. If a team's going to function or an individual is going to have great creative output, one thing you want to think about is idea generation as actually a discipline. And it's kind of at the core of what the book and all the content's about, and then goes into what are the tools and techniques. But, as you've read about Andrew Dyson, 5,000 prototypes got built. So every idea got turned into something, in the first column. But all of these organizations, then we saw this repeat over and over, that there's an enormous number of ideas generated.
So whereas the myth is that innovation is about going from not having anything to having one thing, the truth is it's actually about generating tons of material and then filtering down to the one thing that's actually worth resourcing. And so it's really turning the narrative of innovation on its head. But when we said we had two myths to dispel, we want to talk about the second one, and it's related, but it's slightly different. The other thing that 0 to 1 as an expression kind of insinuates is we got to be laser focused. We don't have anything, but we got to get one thing. So we got to be laser focused. And kind of the poster child for focus, or the focus movement, is an innovator named Steve Jobs, who famously said, innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. And we were talking recently with Greg McEwen, the author of Essentialism, which is a great book. And he said, I love invoking this quote because the essentialist says no to a lot of things. And I can say even innovators like Steve Jobs said no to a lot of things. But while we were talking about the idea ratio that Perry mentioned a moment ago, Greg said, what I never realized is the emphasis here, I've always placed it on no. But that's not the first thing Jobs did. The first thing he did was he had 1,000 things to say no to. And even Greg in that moment realized the volume that's required is certainly extraordinary, but how do you get to that volume? When we think of Steve Jobs, we think of, redefining categories and market disruption and customer delight. But if you talk to his collaborators, what you learn is something fascinating. Sir Johnny Ive gave a memorial address at Steve Jobs' funeral. And he said the following. He said, every day, Steve and I would have lunch. And every day, Steve would say this, hey, Johnny, want to hear a dopey idea? And Sir Johnny Ive said most of the time, the ideas were totally dopey. In fact, sometimes they were truly terrible. But every once in a while, they take the air out of the room and leave us breathless in wonder, as only Sir Johnny Ive can say, right? But the point is, when we think of Steve Jobs, we don't think, what a dope. We don't think that guy's got a bunch of dopey ideas. We think of delight. But Steve Jobs knew what very few of us know, or few of us acknowledge, which is ideas are like all natural phenomena. They fall on a normal distribution. I know that's what you were thinking when you were thinking natural phenomena, right? Statisticians in the crowd. Yeah, which means what? A small percentage of our ideas are delightful. Most of our ideas are ordinary. And about the same number of ideas as are delightful are totally dopey, right? And Steve Jobs is aware of that. It's why he was willing to share dopey ideas with the greatest living designer. Most of us, though, say we don't want dopey. We're okay with ordinary. We really want delightful. So let's just get rid of the dopey ones. And I don't know if the Google technology is set up, but I think I can just chop the dopey off. I can't. And neither can you. Nobody can. We can't. When we get rid of the variation that produces dopey ideas, we also eliminate the variation that produces delightful ideas. And so the reality is we're left with a choice. Do I want to get to delightful ideas? I've got to have the kind of variation and embrace the kind of collaboration that involves dopey ideas too. Or is my goal to not have any dopey ideas? That's fine. In which case I have to acknowledge I'm not going to have any breakthrough ideas either. But breakthrough thinkers have not only volume to their thinking. He met Johnny Ive every day to talk about ideas, right? They also have variability. Right? And this variability not only is a matter of focus, it's also a matter of being willing to flare. And to have that discipline of flaring is something that is intensely possible, but is very counterintuitive to folks who think that innovation is all about focus. So hopefully by this point in our lecture, we're 14 minutes in, or I guess 13 minutes in, we hope you're asking yourself this question. How do I boost the volume and variation of my ideas? And if you are, we have good news for you. We wrote a book on this topic. So, 70,000 words on boosting the volume and variation of your ideas and then sifting through them. we wrote a bonus chapter that we pulled out. We made it free on our website called How to Think Like Bezos in Jobs. Because one of the big realizations from the research behind this book and from interacting with world-class leaders and entrepreneurs these last dozen years is the thing that makes breakthrough thinkers different is how they think. And the way they think can be learned by there's not a genetic difference. There's not a DNA difference. It's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of mindset, worldview, outlook, method. And that's an eminently learnable skill. And if you're a little concerned right now, you go 2,000 ideas. That's because you think an idea is like a tiger. It's like this scary thing. It's fierce. It's fearsome. It's lurking. You don't know when it's going to pop out of the jungle. And what we would say is it's useful to think about our definitions at this stage. I've got a 5-year-old daughter. I have 4 daughters, one of whom is 5. And the research I've read suggests that a 5-year-old girl asks more questions than any other human being on the planet. And I think it's probably accurate. And at least in my household, that's accurate. If she asks me what's an idea, I can't have some esoteric answer because she's going to, give me a look and I'm not actually going to help her. And for a lot of folks who are listening, when they think about volume and variation, it's hugely intimidating. And we would say that's because we have the wrong definition of idea. And we'd like to submit to you a very simple definition. An idea is a connection, very simply. It turns out our brains, neurologically speaking, are incapable of producing new content from scratch. They don't do it. Ex nihilo creation does not exist in our minds. Can't happen. What our brains do is they make and forge unexpected connections between things we already know or are learning. Here's an example. This woman right here is named Bette Nesmith Graham. She's a famous entrepreneur. Don't look her up. I know at Google, anytime I'm at a talk at Google, someone's Googling the thing that people are talking about. So you're just going to spoil the story if you do that right now. But she's on the verge of a breakthrough in this photo. I don't know if you're aware of this. If you can see it in her eyes, she's on the verge of a breakthrough. And the story with Bette Nesmith Graham is she's a single mom in the mid-1950s. She's working at Texas Bank and Trust. Her IBM typewriter is a constant source of frustration because even though technological progress has enabled her to take notes faster, it's also created this headache because the typewriter is constantly smudging her pages. And so she's spending half of her time as a secretary trying to erase the smudges that the technology has created. It's driving her crazy. Many secretaries are aware of this problem. But unlike many secretaries, Bette Nesmith Graham is a single mom. Her husband left after the war, and so she's making ends meet for her family. She's picking up side hustles and goofy weekend jobs and things like that to make ends meet. And one of those jobs delivered the breakthrough connection for her. She was painting a window display in a department store when she made a mistake. And she grabbed her straight edge razor. She started kind of scraping on it as, I would do. And the painter, who is the head of the job, ran over and said, whoa, what are you doing? And she said, I'm just erasing this. I made a mistake. I'm just erasing it. And he said a few words that would change her life. And they changed a lot of our lives. He said, painters don't erase mistakes. Painters paint over their mistakes. Now think about it for a moment. You got a secretary who's constantly frustrated by her typewriter smudges, who just learned painters paint over their mistakes. If you're like, a conscious being right now, you realize she invented whiteout, right? Yeah, she did. Amazing. It's not to say there's not a lot of hard work involved in the creation of this product, right? She had to work with her son's high school chemistry teacher. She had to work with a local paint store employee to concoct the formula. But the point is simply this. We can think somebody like Bette Nesmith Graham she's just making something from nothing. And the tiger just jumped out of the jungle and the idea can remain intimidating because we think that it's just this moment of spontaneous creation. But the truth is, what's an idea? It's just a connection. Painters paint over mistakes connected to my typewriter is smudging my page. And then a connection gets formed. It's almost like Legos, right? I'll give you another example. We work with a company that's working on electric vehicles that'll remain nameless, right? And they're dealing with something called range anxiety. Well, that's a broadly known phenomenon. One of the engineers on the team, she said, imagine with me, she said, I'm in a coffee shop. I overhear a couple of folks in army fatigues come in the door. And she said, I couldn't help myself. I just started eavesdropping. And we say, hey, that's a great creative strategy. Eavesdrop away. And she said, as I was listening to their conversation, I heard they were talking about jet fighters and how they have a small fuel tank and how in the middle of combat, they can't scramble back to the base. They do what's known as a mid-air refueling. Remember, she's trying to solve the problem of range anxiety. And if you're a conscious being right now, we just collectively had this epiphany together we call an idea. Well, what if we just put these two Lego pieces in close enough proximity that we all had this idea. This is how it's not an exception. This is how the brain forges connections. This is how ideas are formed. That kind of moment is when two pieces of knowledge that you possess or that you have acquired come together in an unexpected way. And when you realize this, that nobody starts with nothing, it changes how you interact with the world. All of a sudden you start going, I want to gather Legos. And if I get with Perry, I'm going to bring my bag of Legos and he's going to bring his bag of Legos and we can try on all new combinations. And the point of Ideaflow is equipping individuals with strategies and methods and mindsets to think about the inputs that they're interacting with in the world as the fuel for their ideation, and not necessarily new product and service ideation, but pragmatic problem-solving ideation. We want to give just a couple of simple tools that we think are enormously helpful, that we've observed have been enormously helpful to designers that we've worked with.
So the idea of a bug list, I'm sure this is, for a lot of you, you've heard this term before. This was something at Stanford, David Kelly, who is a professor of mine there, and before him, Bob McKim and John Arnold, these guys, they were the professors that really sort of pioneered a lot of design process, which I think we're building on all of that original work. We were always assigned as students, and to this day for these design programs, we're assigned to have a practice of keeping a bug list. And so there's kind of two ideas here. These are resilient practices. So, this is something that I'll keep around a certain topic and just collect, ideas throughout the day. And it's, you carry a notebook, usually in my back pocket, and just jot down things as they come up during the day. They might be things you notice that are related to, say, a particular challenge you're facing. And some days it's like that for me. I'm trying to solve something, so I carry that around. But it's using the outside world and using your day. So it's not that, one of the questions I think this gets at is a lot of people will ask us, well, how in the world am I going to make time to generate ideas? And I'm so busy. One of the things to do is think about a tool like a bug list is, how do I leverage what I'm already doing? I'm already out in the world. I'm already meeting people. I'm already getting asked questions all day. Maybe there's going to be some material that comes from that. If I just have the discipline to just jot it down and then periodically go back and review it, that is the core idea. And these are sort of amazingly simple ideas, and yet sort of based on some pretty interesting neuroscience. And the bug list, what you're doing is you're carrying a problem in your head or some things you're interested in as you go out and have all your experiences. And what you're doing in your head is you're just colliding your problem with different experiences you're having throughout the day and different people you're meeting. And people don't even have to be aware you're doing this. It's just the discipline of gathering as you inevitably have different experiences throughout your day.
Richard Feynman often told his students that you should always carry your 12 favorite problems around with you everywhere. And it's the same basic idea. If you've got favorite problems, you're likely to stumble upon solutions. But one key to stumbling upon solutions, and again, to state the total obvious, but you actually need to be looking for connections. There's some fascinating research conducted by Carl Dunker back in the 1930s that suggested that difficult problems can be solved by way of analogy, by way of external inspiration, if the person who's receiving that information is prepared to incorporate it into the problem paradigm. And he had a fascinating problem that roughly 10% of the population could solve to begin with. He fed them analogies that had bearing on the problem, and about 30 to 40% could solve it. But then when they were told, see if the analogy has bearing on the problem, all of a sudden, over 80% of people can solve it, right? What's the difference? They were told to consider the possibility of a connection. And that's really important. One of our favorite designers, one of our favorite innovators, is this gentleman here. His name's Bill Bowerman. And if you don't know him, he's the co-founder of Nike along with Phil Knight. He is Oregon's track and field coach. He was the U.S. Olympic track and field coach as well. But he's got this famous moment, and it's worthwhile to just unpack this famous moment, because most people who are familiar with innovation remember kind of the lightning bolt moment that occurred to him in the kitchen one day. And we got to give a shout out to his wife, Barbara, because she's a part of this story. She's making breakfast. She's with him in the kitchen, and Bill is watching her make waffles. And like any good engineer, he looks at the waffle iron and he thinks, I should pour polyurethane in that. And he did. And he ruined her waffle iron. But he also got the formula right over time. And he invented the waffle trainer, which was a radical innovation in the footwear space that not only catapulted Nike from being an import-exporter of Onitsuka into a category all its own, it also ultimately reinvented attire and athleisure. Now, I mean, look at all of us, right? We're all in track shorts below the screen, right? And in running shoes, right? But the point is, how did he do it, right? Is our admonition to innovators at Google to stare longingly into your kitchen appliances? No, that's not the point. Although, as an aside, by the way, Steve Jobs was known to haunt the Cuisinart aisles at Macy's for design inspiration. But aside from that, the point isn't to look at kitchen appliances. The point is to be looking for connections. And what we know about Bill Bowerman is he was a relentless experimenter, a relentless tinkerer. Phil Knight tells a story about how when they'd show up in the locker room as an athlete, you would often find your lockers open and Bowerman has tinkered with your shoes or your gear in some way. And he said, you don't know if you're going to hobble off the track bleeding or you're going to win the race. And Bowerman was known to keep two notebooks. He would keep a notebook of his athlete's performance and he'd keep a notebook of his experiment's performance. This is the kind of person whose waffle iron becomes a muse. It's the kind of person who has this habit of trying new things and experimenting. And just like Bet Nesmith Graham, he doesn't start with nothing. He's got cognitive inputs. He's aware of problems that his runners are facing. He's looking for solutions, right? And when we become aware of that we aren't starting at zero either, it's phenomenally empowering to realize an idea is just a connection, and we can try on connections all the time. It changes how we interface with our colleagues, how we interface with customers and the market and other sources of inspiration, and even the need to be inspired. Everything changes when we realize we're effectively gathering cognitive inputs that can become the building blocks to new ideas. And what we would say is this is in contrast to the mentality of innovation being an event or a workshop or a sprint. All respect for the Google sprint, by the way. But the point is those are events and they're episodic, and people tend to think, if you ask somebody, when's the last time you worked on innovation? They point to a hackathon. They point to a sprint, as if the rest of their life is like the non-creative part of their life or the non-innovative part of their life. And we believe that's a shame. We believe that innovation is actually a practice. It's a routine capability that you're attending to on a daily basis. And the practice is what we've tried our best to do to codify in Ideaflow. Daily, routine, regular behaviors to increase your likelihood of unexpected and novel connections and that ultimately create value in the marketplace. It's not an art book. It's a book about creating value in the marketplace. But the best way to be an effective problem solver is to be oriented around quantity, is to be oriented around seeking fresh input rather than the output, recognizing that the output will routinely flow when you turn your attention in the opposite direction. So with that, we'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. We promised to try to keep the lecture at 30 minutes, and it looks like we did it at 28, which I feel like I stuck to landing. I feel happy with that. But Jana, we're excited to discuss questions that folks have asked. I know you had an advanced copy of the book last week. You got a chance to read it yourself. So we won't give you a pop quiz, but we'd love to hear if you have questions for us based on what we've discussed today.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for that wonderful presentation. And yes, I did get a copy of the book, read the book. I do have some questions based on the book as well, but before I get started into those, I wanted to just ask you both, I'm interested to know what provided the initial inspiration for this book? Were there any patterns that you're observing when working with different students or different companies that helped you really solidify the methodology and the toolkit for ideation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we observed that was really fascinating is we've been aware of the research that Perry mentioned, Bob Sutton's research, for a long time, and we've kind of made passing references to it for a long time. If we poll an audience and ask, Linus Pauling said the way to have a good idea is have a lot of ideas. If you just push a little bit further and say, well, how many is a lot, folks? Most people's guess, oh, you need like 20 ideas to have a good idea. You need, or ambitious people say, you need 100 ideas to get a commercial breakthrough. And what we realize is they're multiple orders of magnitude off per the research. It's not like you need a little bit more, you need a lot more material. And that was something that was categorically underappreciated. And so as we start, as we, now we've been teaching together for 13 years, we start seeing this again and again and again. And we realize so few of the methods or manuals that are being put into the world are really oriented around this idea of volume, that we felt it was a new way to cast a lot of the techniques that have been pioneered at Stanford over the last 60 years, but in a really fresh light, and provide folks some simple daily practices to help get to a different goal around quantity rather than the ordinary goal, which is all about quality.
Great. Yep, that definitely makes sense. I also want to just do a plug. If any audience members have questions, please remember to add them into the chat and I'll get to those, but I'm going to keep going with some of the ones that I have for you. So what I heard from the presentation is that you touched upon that innovation is a practice. It's a routine practice, and it's something that really should be nurtured. It's not just something that's done at a hackathon or a sprint or in the beginning of a conference room for the first 15 minutes of a meeting. Is there something that you can give to those watching this live today, that something quick that they can start to implement right now, like as they leave this talk and want to start this more practice of ideation? What is something small that they can start to work on right now?
So one simple thing is just actually framing up a question. So it's not, I think we talk about idea generation, it presupposes there's a clear question. So thinking about, look at your schedule, there's something I'm gonna make a presentation later, or Jana, you're gonna be leading a meeting later. I want to really kick it off with an interesting anecdote about a customer, or I want to kick it off with something that really gets my team engaged. That's like high pressure, right? If you write that down or hold it in your head, you'll be paying attention to a podcast you listen to. How do they do the first couple of steps? Oh, I'm going to jot down a couple ideas. You're going to notice how somebody else introduces themselves maybe to you throughout the day and say, that was really compelling. Wow, that's interesting. You're going to see a LinkedIn profile and say, wow, that was super interesting, the way that they described themselves in those 2 lines below their photo. And you'll start gathering information. And I think if there's something to do, is to frame up the challenge clearly, particularly if it's something you actually care about, that's going to happen, that you're going to put some effort into. Frame up an interesting question, and then seek to use the next couple hours to gather, a half dozen ideas.
That's great. I love that approach. I think when you really solidify the question and the item that you're asking for, you can help to what you mentioned about trying to figure out the patterns and other ways that things can relate to those to solving that problem. I think that definitely helps ask to figure it out. So the example that you shared earlier about how whiteout was invented, I felt like that was such an interesting story. I think you mentioned that painters don't erase their mistakes. Painters paint over their mistakes. And I do paint in my free time, and I absolutely agree with that statement. That is 100% true. Maybe different than drawing, but you have a quote from the book that someone either has or has not developed a robust creative skill yet. So creativity isn't a gift reserved for the precious few, it's a learned. Can you explain how people can learn to develop more of these skills and creativity?
I mean, the very simplest definition and probably the most useful definition of creativity, there are lots of good ones out there. I'll give you one that you probably haven't heard before. It's from a 7th grader in Ohio who's a part of our K-12 educator network. And her teacher had asked, what's creativity? And she said something that's very profound, but in its simplicity. She said, creativity is doing more than the first thing you think of. And that is cognitively a very profound definition, because it actually speaks to the difficulty we face in trying to generate alternatives because of a lot of cognitive biases. But the cool thing about that definition is it's imminently implementable. If I want to be creative, and you're telling me creativity is simply doing more than the first thing I think of, then the way I can be creative is by thinking of more than one thing whenever I'm thinking of things. Not to be too cheeky, but I'm thinking of subject lines to emails all the time. Why don't I think of more than one? I'm thinking of ways to kick off this meeting all the time. Why not think of more than one? I'm thinking of ways to close this deal. Why not think of more than one? All of those are creative acts, none of which involve a paintbrush. I think both Perry and I adore painting and love the craft. If people only think about painting or that creativity is only relevant to artistic expression, then they access just a fraction of their being. The truth is, creativity is relevant to any problem that you've got to solve. Very few of us are mathematicians solving problems that have one right answer. Most of us are facing problems that are totally nebulous and ambiguous and have 1,000 possible answers, and maybe local maxima, but hardly best, or certainly not only answer. And yet we approach our problems as if there's a math problem for which there's only one right answer. And simply making that shift in orientation from what do I think the answer is to what's more than the first thing I think of, can have profound implications for someone's practical creativity. And that's what we're after, is impacting someone's practical creativity. Generate alternatives. Get in the habit of doing that regularly. It builds amazing resilience and flexibility that will show up in lots of other environments.
Yep, that's a great point. So you spoke about the idea ratio, and 2,000 ideas is closer to maybe that magic number of what it takes to get something that's more quality. So I'm curious, how long does this ideation process usually take? Because we talk about how it's not a hackathon or a sprint, so probably not solved in a day, but do you think it depends on the type of problem that you're solving for? Is there a length of time that takes to get to about 2,000 ideas?
I'd think about it more as a practice. So, Jana, we'll use you as an example. In your role, if you're routinely looking for yourself and your teams to be, generating ideas to solve problems, then I would just say, wow, we're getting really good as a team. It's coming up with, 50 ideas collectively across us. When we arrive at a meeting, let's say you've posed a question to a team, they arrive with a bunch of ideas, and then you select and discuss and maybe work on a few. My hope is that'd be something you sort of measure and then you see, oh, wow, it's climbing. Like we're getting really good at kind of getting to like 100 ideas, and you see when you move that way, then it's saying, okay, on a weekly basis we have good flow of ideas. And as we started to work with the material, one of the things that, a lot of students thought was, oh my gosh, I'm starting a new project. I got to do this 2,000 idea thing. Ugh, what a deal. I got to make the time for it. Cause then it's a lot of work. I don't do it very often. It's like, I'm going to suddenly run a marathon. You know what I mean? I would liken it to that. It's like, you don't run a marathon. You do those of you who've done a marathon, I've only done one. It's like, there's a lot of training, a lot of sort of building into it, a lot of, stuff that was sort of sustained effort. And I would think about creativity the same way for all your listeners.
Great. So I've heard different variations of the phrase, it's not always about the idea, it's about the execution of the idea. To what extent, if any, do you agree with this statement? And then are there some ways that people can generate both great ideas, but also have a framework for an actionable plan to execute on them?
Yeah, it's a great question. The statement, ideas are cheap, is totally true. And I would say it's like the statement, water is cheap. It's totally true, but it's absolutely essential. To say something is cheap doesn't devalue it, right? Water is, we get water out of the tap for basically nothing, right? But you can't live for more than 7 days without it. So the fact that ideas are cheap, most people who say that don't have any ideas. So there's kind of a paradox there. That being said, absolutely execution is everything. And what we would say is, ultimately, the reason that execution is everything is because it's a constant iteration process. No idea has ever survived contact with the customer. None. No business plan has ever survived contact with the market, right? What do you call V2.0? It's another idea, right? So 2000 doesn't mean 2000 totally different, disparate things. It's every variation, every permutation, every iteration. That's all counted. So I would say those statements aren't mutually exclusive at all. The need to generate a ton of ideas is not in conflict with the need to execute. I would, in fact, to say it differently, as we've been teaching entrepreneurs, the single, kind of defining characteristic of a great entrepreneur is they have an ability to craft rapid experiments and to craft scrappy experiments. So that's kind of the core defining ability of an entrepreneur, is they can experiment quickly. Well, what we teach our students is, if you've got a rigorous experimentation practice, it only takes a few days of experimenting to realize you better have a robust ideation practice too. Because when you start experimenting, then you got it. Like if you run an A/B test, for example, you have to have a B. Well, what's a B? It's another idea, right? And then tomorrow's A/B test needs another B, needs another variation. And so ideation is the fuel for experimentation. And the fact that experimentation ultimately tells us what wins doesn't negate the fact that you need ideas. It actually justifies the fact that we need ideas to put into an experimental process. So to us, they're two sides of the same coin. And what we would say is, most people value the action and they value the experimentation. They value the perspiration, right? Whatever, there's some quote, 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. It bears saying you can't do the perspiration without the inspiration. You can't do the experimentation without the ideas, right? And so to foreground one, we feel that ideation has become unnecessarily devalued in this kind of rah around experimentation and action. And what people don't realize is ideation is the fuel for all of that stuff too.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to touch a little bit more on what you said about experimentation, because you mentioned this a lot in your book as well. So why do you think it is important that organizations develop this experimental mindset? And it sounds like the experimental mindset will really help also with idea validation and even execution of it. So could you touch a little bit more about this process?
So we teach the students to, in the sort of face of uncertainty, to figure out experiments they can run. So they try to get these correlated to a reaction. And if I'm in an organization or running a team, or we're in a bunch of people and we're doing something uncertain, let's say we have to let's make it really simple. Like we have to give a presentation to the senior leadership. The experiment might be, wow, let's figure out a couple of titles for it and, email them to, one of the leaders we know well and just get a quick read. That would be a quick experiment where you could see what's the reaction on a force rank, like rank these, right? It's a quick experiment, quick brainstorm with the team, generate an experiment, which is we're going to put these in front of a leader and get a quick valence as to which ones are moving up and which ones are moving down. And it's going to remove a chunk of risk from this project, right? And that's the way we think of it, is the experiments being crafted for. We actually do a process where we evaluate. So we have students run experiments on their work, right? And we evaluate them based on least amount of effort to most amount of learning. And that's what I think is magical about sort of getting really good at experimentation inside of an organization, is we get really good at not deploying a lot of effort, time, concern, and stress to generate a lot of information that's going to sort of get us moving forward with data and some information back from the user. I think, Google's got loads of examples of sort of trying quick things and people can do things on their time. And I think it's an organization where that's sort of built in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of the products tend to generate user data really easily. It's very measurable. What's conversion? Are people using it? What's the dwell time? Do they recommend it to somebody? All that's, the kinds of things you want to do. But bringing it back to, you can do very, very simple things like send an email and just get a quick response, right?
Yeah.
I think if I may, one additional thought there too, Janet, is part of the reason that we emphasize experimentation so much is because people are obsessed with data. Everybody loves data, and the more data, the better, or so the thinking goes. We'd say the better data, the better. And more isn't always better data, right? You can run a survey. I mean, I've been a management consultant with a clipboard in the food court of a mall, and I've surveyed a lot of people, and I got all the answers that I wanted, right? Is that good data? I talked to 10,000 people. Well, if you're my boss at the firm, it's good data because it says fund the project, right? And that's what I wanted when I sent me out into the food court, right? But if you're a fiduciary seeking to understand, wait, should we move in this direction? More data like that is not helpful. And hiring an army of clipboard toting, puppy dog-eyed interns to hit food courts across America isn't going to get you what you need, even though it's technically more data. For us, experimentation is the way to create credible data. And that's the important thing. And we believe in, there's emphasis on big data. That's all well and good. We believe strongly in little data, in the value of little data, where you have small data sets that are highly credible because they've been created through thoughtful experimentation. That's really valuable information, much more valuable than survey data that, yeah, you can get huge numbers of people to respond, but the credibility of that kind of data is very low.
Yep, that definitely makes sense. Like thinking about how to get that insight very early on and with a smaller group before you go out and test it out. I'm going to switch over to some audience Q&A now. So first question from Anjana. Do you think that in large companies, a culture of experimentation and innovation can only work when it's put in place by leaders? Are there barriers in enterprises to incubation of ideas?
There's really two questions there. Maybe Perry, I'll take the first one, you take the second one. I don't know, or we can go the other way around. But Anjana, great question. I would say certainly leadership helps. Leaders cast an enormous shadow and have an enormous impact on the kinds of behaviors that are accepted. I feel though that being said, blaming leadership or blaming org policy or legal or whatever it is, oftentimes is kind of a little bit of a scapegoat, because the reality is experimentation can be scary. We're working with a big pharmaceutical company that has a really cool idea for a doctor's office intervention. And really what they need to do is put it in a handful of doctor's offices. And that requires that they pick up the phone and call some doctor's offices. And boy, it sure is convenient for somebody to hear a rumor that legal says they can't do that, right? You know why? Whose fault is that? It's not legal's fault. It's the people who are a little bit afraid to do an experiment, who are looking for a good reason why the organization won't let me experiment. And we see that a lot, that leadership, writ large gets blamed for what really is a personal, I don't want to say failure, but a personal vulnerability. It's scary. Putting something in the world that you're not sure it's right is kind of scary. Taking a risk is scary. Putting yourself out there is. And so in a way, it's very convenient to say, I would have done this, but leadership wouldn't let me. So what we often espouse is this idea of manage down, not up, meaning you can't control what your boss says or what the CEO says about what's allowed. You do have control over how people roll up to you, right? So a simple example, Bob McKim, who Perry mentioned earlier, he had this famous saying, anytime a student would ask him what he thought of a project, Bob McKim would always respond with, show me 3. I want to see options before I can give you feedback, right? That's a really, really great management and leadership tactic. And every CEO should have that ingrained in their minds, right? Show me 3 is very, very wise. If as an individual contributor or as a middle manager in the organization, I can do one of two things. I can say, man, I wish my manager would say, show me 3. Sure would be a lot better place to work if my boss would ask me for alternatives. Then ideation and experimentation would be valued here, right? Or you can say, for the people who report to me, I'm going to say, show me 3. I can't control what my boss says, and I've got to have the right answer to my boss. But anytime somebody rolling up to me has an idea, I'm going to say, show me 3, right? And to me, that's a great example of managing down the span of control, the sphere of influence that you have. Think about working differently and setting conditions differently there. Trying to change things in the other direction is a fool's errand. And it probably is more, it appeals more to a sense of, what's the opposite of agency? inability, whatever, whatever the opposite of agency is. Trying to change things upward is kind of like a hopeless act. Trying to change things downward is a bold, high agency act of courage.
Yeah, and Jan, I think that question, the thing I've learned about creativity from teaching it to so many students from different walks of life and different ages is it's a very personal thing. And we're throwing around try this, try that, there's no recipe. If Jana, if you and I went to a gym and we wanted to get in shape, we would do different tactics to have a similar outcome. We want to be fit or we want to feel good, but I might use this particular set of machines and you might use, and we end up in the same place, which is we're fit and we've worked out and we've burned a bunch of calories. It's very similar with creativity. The book's filled with stuff. And if you don't buy the book, just look at some of the things we have online or look at some of the resources at the d.school site. And as far as leadership, I think leadership's job is to make it safe for people to work there and try things and be their whole selves and bring their creativity out. But the thing I hope they don't have a boss that tells them how to be creative, because that's not the recipe. So the other end is, a recipe of we're going to brainstorm in every meeting. And we're going to have a certain number of ideas and we're going to get a dashboard. I mean, can you imagine maybe you guys have a dashboard, so I don't want to say this, but a dashboard on, metrics and numbers, and let's really be efficient about our creativity. It's like, that's where I goes if there's too much involvement. But I'd say more the conditions. If I'm in a team, I can be safe and vulnerable. Let's try some of these things. I personally test more as an introvert. Maybe a lot of your listeners do. There's certain tools and techniques that work for me that wouldn't be as popular for another person I work directly with. And that's kind of one of the interesting things to sort out as a team is how do you have very, very different creative practices and use all of the benefits of different styles and different brains and different backgrounds on your team to bring out the best ideas.
Yeah, that's great. I think this next question actually from the audience touches a little bit on that. So I'd love for you to go a little bit deeper here. So Josh says, thank you, Jeremy and Perry, for the talk today. Do you see common traits, characteristics, backgrounds, etc., in the people who can ideate beyond the first idea?
One of the fabulous tricks we've learned from an improv virtuoso at Stanford named Dan Klein. He has a great expression which gets to this characteristic, Josh. He says, don't be creative, be obvious. And the irony is when we're willing to be obvious, we're wildly creative to others, because what's obvious to us is totally unexpected to everybody else. I'm a preacher's kid from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who, waited tables at Macaroni Grill and the University of Texas, fine dining establishment that spent a bunch of time in spreadsheets, right? What's obvious to me is probably not what's obvious to Jana, which is to say what? When Jana hears my obvious, she goes, whoa, that's creative. And now here's the question. How does she respond? Does Jana need to say something that's creative to her? If so, she's going to go, she's going to be spinning her wheels. But if she says the thing that obviously comes to her mind, I'm going to say, what? That's obvious. I'm going to say, whoa, that's so creative, right? Why? Because she's coming from a different background. And there's something simple, that simple willingness to say the obvious thing, not the best idea, but the next idea, so to speak. That's really where teams are able to ideate and ultimately kind of spin themselves into a totally unexpected area where everybody on the team says, it's not my job to be creative. It's just my job to support the brilliance in others. And if everybody feels that way, if everybody's kind of willing and courageous to be obvious, then the team gets somewhere that no one in the team could have imagined before. Not specifically because no one's predetermining where the conversation is going to go, where the ideation is going to go. Everybody's kind of discovering as they go, which is it's a really fun feeling to have if you've been a part of it.
So I guess similar to that concept in improv, that's the whole yes and continuing that, right?
Yeah, and for Josh also, I think about it that I wouldn't say nobody's endowed with creativity, and we've seen people who are very creative become uncreative because they're under stress or all those things. And I think the thing I would maybe counsel Josh is just think about your own creative practice. Like the people that are routinely creative have a practice around it. They have some discipline. They're keeping a bug list. They're framing up interesting challenges and jotting them down in a notebook. So they sort of carry them throughout the day. They're collecting. They're reviewing ideas. They're framing up challenges for their teams so they can actually get ideas from their teams. And they're sort of building a practice around it and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And I'd say that with our best design students. If you ask what your creative practice is, they kind of have an answer. They'd say, well, I do these things in the morning, and I try to generate ideas at the early part of the day around particular challenges and bring those to teams later, so they can answer sort of how they're navigating in their work and personal life, being creative.
I have another question. So how does, and I think it touches upon what we were just saying, but how does occasionally changing up our routines and habits, how can this help spark more insights?
Yeah, I mean, our imaginations are, I've heard someone say, imagination is triggered by unexpected input, which is a nice way of kind of giving permission to seek inspiration. And changing routines necessarily, taking a different train to work or taking a different, pathway to work or something like that. I read about a senior executive at Bloomberg. She never takes the same way to work ever. Bloomberg wrote an article about it because it was so interesting. But it's a simple way of, and changing up routines or habits is a simple way of exposing yourself to new cognitive inputs. Again, this idea of gathering Legos. And we start to, like there's this notion of functional fixedness or cognitive fixedness. Whenever we get in a routine, the benefit of it is we don't have to think. The cost of it is we don't think, right? And so the routines are really helpful because they eliminate cognitive load. But when you recognize that part of the task, to Perry's point earlier about creative practice, mixing things up is phenomenally valuable when you know that what you need fresh input and you need to not be, shut off cognitively. Changing your routines can be a really helpful strategy.
And it's super easy to do. Many of your listeners work in organizations with a lot, there's lots and lots of people. One of these, an executive, I cannot remember his name, was a fellow from New Zealand. He had a really simple practice to shake things up, which was he just would kind of look around and figure out who haven't I had a coffee with in a really long time. That's my today coffee, or he'd invite them in that week. So he's just said it's 20 minutes of my time, but the questions they ask, because we haven't caught up in a long time about my work, it's just they're all really great inputs to just get me to rethink what I'm prioritizing, what I'm working on. I can share a particular challenge I have and get a completely fresh perspective. And that's something, maybe in this Zoom, if we're on Zoom or on Google Hangout, whatever, there may be a chance to do that with that medium as well. Is just saying, hey, could somebody hang out for a minute afterwards? Haven't had a chance to catch up. Those are simple things that just break routine. And to your point, Jana, that drives a lot of creative output.
Yeah, that's great. So I know we're getting close on time here. So I wanted to just ask you both if you have any final things that you'd like to share, any wisdom you'd like to share out with the audience before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think that if there's something that I think talking about all this stuff, I think we tend to make it seem more complicated than it is. And I'd say that the other thing is you can take a look at what you're doing now and just realize there's things probably in my daily life that are either opportunities to be amplified around creative practice or things I'm already doing. Wow, this gave me a chance to realize I actually want to focus on that. I actually want to give it a little bit more valence in my life and leverage it more. Or there's a particular challenge I'm already going to work on. Why wouldn't I think about my creative practice and think about it really simply? Like it's not, I've got to stop and I've just got to start to be creative instead of you already are, and take a look at the practices.
Yeah, I think one of the fun things to do is to document a breakthrough whenever it happens, whenever you realize, oh, that's a really cool solution, or that's something that I hadn't thought of before. I've gotten in the habit of just taking a picture. And a lot of times it's because I've overlooked something. I'm not responsible for the breakthrough. Somebody's provided a perspective in a way that was very useful to me, or someone's pointed something out and I didn't know it. I try to document those things because you can kind of almost reverse engineer what is your own breakthrough kind of, fingerprint, so to speak. How do you do it? If you become aware of the kind of the ingredients to those breakthrough moments, gives you more of an appreciation for, oh, you know what? Like Perry said, talking to somebody different always leads to new ideas, right? If I look back at my last 10 really interesting ideas, it all came from these random conversations. Well, can I now operationalize that and make random conversation a feature of my life rather than something I avoid, right? As an example. So having that habit of documenting and paying attention a lot of times illuminates tactics that perhaps you hadn't appreciated before.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much for being here on Talks at Google. As a reminder to the audience, Jeremy and Perry's new book on Ideaflow, The Only Business Metric That Matters, is out now. So it's filled with a lot of stories and examples and ways to incorporate the practice of ideation into your daily routine. A lot of the concepts that Jeremy and Perry talked about today are really covered in the book, and I enjoyed reading it. I hope you will too. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jana.
Thank you.
Thanks to the team there, Mike and others.